My brother declared me dead while I worked in Iceland. He stole $1.2 million from my inheritance, sold my house, and faked my funeral. But when I came back to life, his wife confessed everything, and now he never saw coming what I did to him. I'm 30 years old. I work as a digital cartographer, and what I'm about to tell you literally sounds like a bad Netflix movie. But I swear it's real. A few years ago, when I was 27, I got this incredible job in Iceland, doing topographic mapping and that technical cartography stuff for an environmental conservation project. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the kind of work that only comes around once. But there was a problem. I was going to be in a super remote area, like in the middle of nowhere Iceland, with internet access only every 2 or 3 months, when I'd go down to some town to resupply. Cell phone signal was basically non-existent in the area where I was going to work. Obviously, my parents were worried. Well, my mom mostly because my dad had passed away like 3 years before that, from cancer, and she was still processing all of that. I have an older brother, Benjamin, who at the time was like 29 years old, and we'd always been close, or so I thought. He worked in finance, had a wife, Rebecca, and a young daughter, Ava, who was like 7 years old at the time. Benjamin was always the responsible son. The one who does everything right, got married young, had a stable career, that kind of thing. I was more the adventurous son, I guess. Before I left, my mom and Benjamin insisted that I needed to give someone power of attorney to handle my stuff while I was gone. Like paying bills, managing my house, those basic things. I had a small house I'd bought with part of my dad's inheritance. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. I also had some investments and savings accounts, the rest of the inheritance my dad had left to Benjamin and me. So anyway, who else was I going to give power of attorney to, if not my brother? It was the obvious choice. I trusted him completely, and he promised me he'd take care of everything. He even joked that he'd charge me a coffee for every bill he paid. I left for Iceland in September 2019, right before the world went crazy with the pandemic. Though, I didn't know that yet. The first few months were incredible. I mean, the work was hard and lonely, but the landscape was mind-blowing. Glaciers, northern lights, volcanoes, all that postcard stuff. I communicated with my family when I could, sent long emails when I got to a town with internet, occasional calls. Benjamin sent me updates about the house, told me everything was fine, bills were up to date, that kind of thing. My mom wrote me physical letters that arrived at the project office every 2 months or so, telling me about her life, her garden, family Sundays. The thing is that when you live so isolated, like literally just you, nature, and your work equipment, time passes differently. Days blend together, weeks fly by, and before you know it, months have passed without you really processing how much time you've been there. I had an initial 2-year contract, but with an option to extend, and since the project was going well, and honestly, we gotten used to that life, I decided to stay a 3rd year. I let Benjamin know by email. He told me no problem, he'd keep managing everything. My mom got a little sad but understood it was important for my career. Now, this is where things get weird. In March 2022, like 2.5 years after I'd left, my professional camera breaks. It was an expensive camera, like $8,000 or something like that, and I needed to get it fixed urgently because it was essential for my work. I decided to make the trip to Reykjavik, which was like a 2-day journey from where I was, to take it to a specialized technician. I arrived in the city after being basically alone in nature for months, and the first thing I did was go to a cafe with decent Wi-Fi because I needed to download some work files and, honestly, I wanted to see what had happened in the world. I sat down with my laptop, ordered a coffee that cost like €9 because Iceland is ridiculously expensive, and opened my Facebook for the first time in months. And that's when my life fell apart. The first thing I saw in my feed was a post from my college friend Jordan. Something he'd posted like 3 weeks earlier. It said something like, "Still can't believe Lucas left us like that. So young, so sudden, rest in peace, brother." And it had a photo of me from when we graduated from college. I stared at the screen, not understanding anything. I literally thought it was some kind of weird joke or that I was misinterpreting something. I kept scrolling, and there was more. A lot more posts. My ex-girlfriend from college, Melissa, had written this long emotional post about how she regretted not working things out before I, quote-unquote, tragically passed away. There were pictures of me in memorial mode everywhere, people commenting about how much they missed me, some old coworkers sharing anecdotes. It was surreal. Like watching your own funeral on social media. My hands were shaking so much, I almost knocked over the coffee. I started hyperventilating right there in the cafe, and the waitress came over to ask if I was okay, and I didn't even know what to tell her because, how do you explain that you just discovered you're supposedly dead? I called Jordan immediately. I didn't care that it was like 4 inches the morning in the United States. He answered after like 10 rings, with a sleepy and confused voice. And when I said, "Hello, Jordan, it's Lucas," he went quiet for a moment. So long I thought he'd hung up. "Lucas," he finally said, with a weird voice like between shock and fear, like he was talking to a ghost. I asked him what the hell was going on, why there were posts about my death on Facebook. He still couldn't process that it was really me. He made me answer questions that only I would know. Random stuff about our time in college. When he finally convinced himself, he told me everything. He said that Benjamin, my brother, had called all our mutual friends and family like 4 months ago, in November 2021, to tell them I had died in a car accident in Iceland, that my body had been cremated there according to my supposed wishes, and that the family was having a small private funeral because, according to Benjamin, I had expressed that I wanted something intimate. I couldn't breathe. I literally felt like someone was squeezing my chest. I asked Jordan what else he knew, and he told me that Benjamin had been the one handling everything, that he'd been consoling my mom, that he'd organized some kind of memorial, and that basically everyone had given him condolences for the loss of his younger brother. Jordan asked me where I was, if I was okay, if I needed help, and all I could tell him was that I was in Reykjavik, that I was physically fine, but I needed to figure out what the hell was going on. After hanging up with Jordan, I went into total panic mode. I tried calling my mom, but her phone was off or out of service. The number didn't work anymore. I tried calling Benjamin, and same thing, number unavailable. I looked for Rebecca on Facebook, and her profile was blocked to me. I couldn't see anything or send her a message. It was like my previous life had been erased, and I was a ghost, trying to contact the living. I started investigating more on the internet, searching my name plus obituary or news about any accident in Iceland, but I didn't find anything official. However, I found a GoFundMe page that Rebecca had supposedly created to help with funeral expenses and support for my mom, and it had raised like $30,000. The description was super emotional. Talked about how I had died chasing my dreams, how my family was devastated, all very well written and convincing. The comments were full of people giving condolences and sharing memories. I spent the whole night in that cafe until they closed, just investigating and trying to understand. I looked up my house on Google Street View, and it showed up with a sold sign. My house, the one I had, bought with my inheritance, showed up as sold. I looked up public property records, and sure enough, it had been sold in February 2021, like over a year earlier. The sale had been for $340,000, a decent amount for that area. The next day, I went to the United States Embassy in Reykjavik. I explained the situation, and at first they thought I was crazy or confused, but I showed them my passport, my IDs, everything. They verified my legal status and confirmed that indeed I was alive and well, obviously, but that in the United States there was a death certificate in my name issued in November 2021. The woman at the embassy went pale when she saw that. She told me this was extremely serious, that someone had committed massive fraud, and that I needed to contact the authorities in the United States immediately. I flew back to the United States the next day, leaving my project and my work without prior notice. I didn't care about anything. I just needed to get home and resolve this. The flight from Reykjavik to New York was like the longest 6 hours of my life. I couldn't sleep at all. I just kept turning it over in my head, trying to understand why Benjamin would do something like this. I landed in New York, and from there took another flight to our hometown in the Midwest. When I landed, I tried calling my mom again, and this time someone answered, but it wasn't her, it was a man. He said his name was Charles, and he was my mom's husband. My mom had remarried, and I had no idea. I told him I needed to talk to her urgently, that I was her son Lucas, and he went quiet for a moment and then said in a very serious voice that he didn't know who I was or what kind of sick joke this was, but that it wasn't funny to impersonate his wife's deceased son. I begged him to believe me, that I could prove it, and he finally agreed to pass the phone to my mom. "Me, Joe," she said, and her voice sounded broken, fragile, so different from how I remembered it. "Mom, it's me. I'm alive," I told her. She started crying, those deep sobs that break your soul. She kept saying, "No, no, this isn't happening. Benjamin told me you had died. I saw photos of the accident. We had a funeral." I told her there was no accident, that Benjamin had lied, that I had been in Iceland all this time working. She couldn't process anything. She was basically in shock. Charles took the phone again, and in a calmer voice told me that if I really was Lucas, I needed to come to the house with identification, and that he'd bring a police officer to verify my identity. He gave me the address, which was different from the house where my mom had lived before. Apparently, she had moved too. I took an Uber there. It was like an hour from the airport. The house was nice, in a quiet neighborhood I didn't recognize. Charles opened the door, a man about 55 years old, tall, with gray hair, and a kind but worried face. There was a police officer with him. I had to show my passport, driver's license, answer a bunch of questions, and they even took my fingerprints to verify. When they finally confirmed it was really me, that Lucas was alive, the officer got serious and said this was a case of identity fraud and possible theft, and that we needed to file a formal complaint. My mom came out of a room at the back of the house. She looked older than I remembered, with more gray hair, more wrinkles, like she'd aged 10 years in these 3. When she saw me, she froze in the middle of the hallway, just staring at me like I was an apparition. "Mom," I said, and she collapsed. She literally fell to the floor crying, and I ran to her and hugged her, and we both stayed there crying on the hallway floor for I don't know how long. When we finally calmed down a bit, Charles took us to the living room and made us tea, which nobody really drank, but it was something to do. My mom kept touching my face, my arm, like to make sure I was real. She asked me over and over how it was possible, what had happened. I told her everything about Iceland, about the work, about giving Benjamin power of attorney, about discovering the posts on Facebook. She went pale when I mentioned Benjamin. She told me her version of the story. She said that Benjamin had called her in November 2021, completely devastated, saying he had received a call from the authorities in Iceland informing him that I had died in a car accident, that my car, which I had apparently rented, had gone off the road in a snowstorm and had fallen off a cliff, that my body had been found days later, and that due to the trauma of the accident and conditions in Iceland, the best thing was to cremate my remains there. Benjamin had shown her documents, photos of the accident, which were now obviously fake, even a death certificate that looked completely official. My mom organized a small memorial with Benjamin's help. She sold her house, the house where I had grown up, because according to her, the memories were too painful after losing my dad and now me. She moved to a smaller apartment for a while. Benjamin convinced her to give him part of her retirement savings, like $80,000, supposedly to help with legal expenses related to my death and to establish an educational fund for Ava in my memory. She gave him the money without questioning it because she trusted him completely. 6 months later, my mom met Charles in a support group for people in mourning. Charles had lost his wife to cancer a few years earlier. They became friends, then something more, and like 3 months ago, they got engaged. The wedding was planned for 2 weeks from then. A small ceremony at a local church. Benjamin was going to be the best man, obviously, my mom's only living son. When my mom finished telling her story, I asked her about Benjamin, where he was, if I could contact him. She called his cell phone, and he answered after several rings. I put the phone on speaker. "Hi, Mom," Benjamin said, with a cheerful voice. "What's up?" "Lucas is alive," my mom said directly, without beating around the bush. The silence on the other end of the phone was so heavy, you could feel it physically. "What?" Benjamin finally said, his voice completely different now, flat, cautious. "He's here with me," my mom continued. "Lucas is alive. He never died. It was all a lie. Benjamin tried to say something, but my mom hung up. She literally hung up the phone and started crying again. Charles looked at me and said we needed to involve a lawyer immediately, that this was bigger than it seemed. The police officer who was still there told me I needed to go to the station to file a formal complaint, that this was identity fraud, possibly theft, forgery of official documents, among other things. The next few days were absolute chaos. I went to the police station and spent like 6 hours giving my statement, explaining everything, providing evidence that I had been in Iceland all this time, showing my work records, emails, everything. They started an immediate investigation and got a warrant to review Benjamin's finances and all transactions related to my accounts. That's when we discovered the real magnitude of the disaster. Benjamin hadn't just faked my death, he had completely emptied all my accounts. My dad's inheritance, which had been approximately $800,000 for each of us, had disappeared from my accounts. My house had been sold and he had kept the money. He had taken out loans in my name, like 3 personal loans for a total of $150,000, which he obviously never paid. He had used my identity to open credit cards, accumulate debts, everything. In total, between what he stole and the debts he created in my name, we're talking about more than $1.5 million. We also discovered that the family lawyer, Gregory, who had worked with my dad for years, was involved. He had helped Benjamin forge the death certificate, had processed the sale of my house, had facilitated fund transfers, everything legal on paper but completely fraudulent. Gregory was also being investigated. Benjamin tried to contact me several days after my mom confronted him. He sent me a long text message, basically trying to explain that he had gone into financial panic, that he had gambling debts I didn't know about, that he was going to lose his house, that he was desperate, that the idea of faking my death had started as a crazy fantasy when he was drunk one night, but that then he realized he could actually do it given that I was so isolated in Iceland, that he never thought I would come back, that he thought I'd stay there permanently, or at least long enough for him to stabilize financially and eventually confess that there had been an error and that I was alive after all. His message was pathetic, full of excuses and self-justifications. He said he loved me, that I was his brother, that he never really wanted to hurt me, as if stealing my entire life wasn't hurting me. I didn't respond. The investigation continued for weeks. They discovered that Benjamin had spent the money on basically everything, from paying his gambling debts, he had a severe poker addiction that nobody in the family knew about, to buying a new car for Rebecca, renovating his house, expensive vacations. Rebecca apparently didn't know anything about the origin of the money. Benjamin had told her he had received a big bonus at work and an inheritance from a distant uncle. 2 weeks after my return was my mom's wedding day. She asked me if I wanted to be there, if I felt comfortable with that. I told her obviously yes, that just because my life was chaos didn't mean her happiness had to wait. I liked Charles from the beginning. You could tell he really loved my mom and that he had been there for her during what she thought was mourning my death. The ceremony was in a small church, like 40 people. Benjamin wasn't invited, obviously. Some of the guests looked at me like they'd seen a ghost, literally, because many of them had been at my memorial. It was super weird but also emotional. My mom looked happy, really happy, for the first time in years probably. After the wedding, things with Benjamin intensified. He hired a lawyer and tried to argue that I had given him implicit permission to use my money, that the power of attorney I had given him covered this. All kinds of legal nonsense that obviously weren't going anywhere. His lawyer was as bad as he was, honestly. Rebecca contacted me like a month after all this. She said she needed to talk to me, that she had found things in the house she needed me to see. I agreed to meet her at a public cafe. She looked devastated. With deep, dark circles, she'd lost weight. She apologized to me like 1,000 times for not knowing what Benjamin was doing, for benefiting unknowingly from the stolen money. I believed her. Honestly, you could tell she was being sincere. She showed me documents she had found in Benjamin's study, hidden in a safe she had managed to open. There was more evidence of the fraud. Records of conversations between Benjamin and Gregory, planning everything. Even drafts of my fake death certificate with different dates. There was also evidence that Benjamin had been sabotaging my career before I left for Iceland, sending emails from fake accounts to my previous bosses saying negative things about me, trying to make me look bad. There were messages where he told Gregory that he needed me to be as isolated as possible, that Iceland was perfect for his plans. The most disturbing thing was a folder with information about Melissa, my ex-girlfriend. Apparently, Benjamin had contacted Melissa after she and I broke up, pretending to be a concerned friend, telling her lies about me, that I had cheated on her, that I talked badly about her. Melissa and I had ended badly because of misunderstandings that I now realized Benjamin had orchestrated. He had deliberately destroyed that relationship, probably because Melissa would have been an obstacle to his plans. Rebecca told me she was going to divorce Benjamin, that she couldn't be married to someone like that anymore. She asked me about Ava, my niece, who at the time was like 10 years old. Ava still thought her dad was a good man, didn't know anything about what he'd done. Rebecca didn't know how to explain to her daughter that her father was basically a criminal. I told her I didn't have easy answers, but that Ava deserved to know the truth eventually, in an age-appropriate way. Rebecca turned over all the documents she found to the prosecutors, and that basically sealed the case against Benjamin. Gregory was also arrested for his complicity. Both were formally charged, Benjamin with fraud, identity theft, forgery of official documents, among other charges. Gregory was charged with conspiracy and facilitation of fraud. Benjamin's trial was like 8 months later, in June 2023. I had to testify, telling the whole story in front of a jury. Seeing Benjamin, sitting at the defense table, in a cheap suit, looking gaunt and small, was surreal. This was my brother, the same one who taught me to ride a bike when I was 5 years old, who defended me from bullies at school, who was by my side at my dad's funeral. And he was also the person who had stolen my entire life without remorse. During his testimony, Benjamin tried to blame his gambling addiction, financial pressure, society, everything except himself. He never really apologized, never took real responsibility. The jury didn't believe him at all. He was found guilty on all charges. Before sentencing, I had the opportunity to give a victim impact statement. I was up all night before writing and rewriting it. In the end, I decided to keep it simple and honest. I told the judge how Benjamin hadn't just stolen money from me, he had stolen 3 years of my life with my family. He had stolen the opportunity to be with my mom when she needed me. He had stolen relationships and opportunities. I told him that the person I thought I knew no longer existed, if he ever really existed at all. Benjamin was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 15 years. Gregory received 10 years. When they read the sentence, Benjamin's face completely fell apart. He started crying, asking for forgiveness, saying he was sorry, but it was too late for that. The financial part was another battle. We managed to recover approximately $700,000 of what Benjamin had stolen. Some of his assets were liquidated, his house was sold, his accounts emptied. But obviously it wasn't everything. A lot of the money was already spent, gone forever. The loans in my name were canceled after proving the fraud. My credit was eventually restored, but it was a long and painful process. Rebecca divorced Benjamin while he was awaiting sentencing. She asked me to stay in touch with Ava, to keep being her uncle despite everything. I agreed because Ava wasn't to blame for any of this. Now I see Ava, like once a month. I take her to the movies, or for ice cream. I try to be a stable figure in her life. She knows her dad is in prison for bad things he did, but Rebecca and I decided she doesn't need to know the specific details yet. That'll come when she's older. My mom and Charles supported me through the whole process. I stayed with them the first few months after returning, while I re-established myself. Charles turned out to be incredible. He helped me navigate all the legal aspects, introduced me to an excellent lawyer he'd known when he worked in the police years ago. My mom and I went to therapy together for a while, processing everything, the fake death, Benjamin's betrayal, all the trauma. With the recovered money, I established an educational fund for Ava, like Benjamin had supposedly planned to do with my mom's money. Ironic, I guess. The rest I invested wisely, bought a new house, smaller than the previous one, but it's mine. I also used part to start a non-profit foundation that helps victims of family financial fraud. Because I discovered during this whole process that my story wasn't unique, that there are many people betrayed by family members in horrible ways. As for Melissa, I looked her up after everything calmed down a bit. I explained to her what Benjamin had done, how he had sabotaged our relationship years ago. She was shocked. Many things about our breakup finally made sense to her. We didn't get back together. Too much time had passed, and we were both different people now, but we made peace and became friends again. She's married now, has a baby, looks happy, and that's enough for me. I eventually went back to work, but not in field cartography. I got a remote job doing geographic data analysis, something I can do from home. I'm not ready to isolate myself from the world like that again. I need to be close to my family now. My mom and Charles live 20 minutes away. I see them 2 or 3 times a week. On Sundays we have dinner together, something that's become our tradition. Benjamin writes me letters from prison. I opened the first ones. They were more of the same, excuses and self-justifications. After like 5 letters, I stopped opening them. I keep them in a box in my closet. I don't know why. Maybe someday I'll read them all, maybe not. Ava asks me sometimes if I've talked to her dad, and I tell her honestly, no. That I'm still not ready for that. She seems to understand. The thing is that forgiveness is complicated, right? Everyone says that forgiving is for yourself, not for the other person, that it frees you from anger and all that. And maybe they're right, I don't know. But forgiving someone who literally erased you from existence, who stole your identity, your money, your time with your loved ones, that's not something that happens overnight. Maybe someday I can forgive Benjamin. But today is not that day, and that's okay. What I do know is that my life is mine again now. I have my house, my work, my family, my future. Benjamin tried to take all of that and he almost succeeded, but in the end, he failed. I'm still here, still alive, literally and figuratively. My mom is happy with Charles. Ava has people who love and support her. Rebecca is rebuilding her life. Things aren't perfect. There are scars that probably will never heal completely, but we're moving forward. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, unable to sleep, I think about those 3 years in Iceland, about how ironic it is that while I was mapping unknown terrain, my own life was being completely redesigned without my knowledge. I think about how I blindly trusted my brother, how I never saw any of this coming. And I think about how, if my camera hadn't broken that day in March, if I hadn't gone to Reykjavik, if I hadn't gone into that cafe with Wi-Fi, maybe I never would have discovered the truth. Maybe I'd still be in Iceland, blissfully ignorant, while Benjamin lived my life in my place. But my camera did break. I did go to Reykjavik. I did discover the truth. And now I'm here. On the other side of all that chaos, trying to build something new with the pieces Benjamin left behind. It's not the life I planned. It's not the family I grew up with. But it's mine. And nobody's going to take it from me again.